Foundation for the NIH is so proud to present you the 2024 Lurie Prize in Biomedical Science for your breakthrough contributions to the field of non-coding RNA. So we're going to have our picture made, and then we're going to have a little chat. You know, I am an infectious disease doctor, and if you know anything about bacteria, you know they grow 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. They grow in log phase. If they become in the stationary phase, one of two things has to happen. Either you have to give them more media, or you have to put them in a bigger beaker, because if you don't do that, they die. So my goal in life is to stay in log phase. I want to keep learning and growing and contributing as much as possible. So one of the ways I stay in log phase is for this moment, because I've had to read all kinds of articles to really understand the science that these two gentlemen are leading, and it's opened up a whole new world of biology and genetics that I certainly didn't study in medical school. So thank you for keeping me in log phase. But let me start a little bit by asking you to tell your stories. You have fascinating beginnings. And I'll start with you, Vijay, because I know you grew up in Boston. Kind of your father was, I think, an engineer, and your mother was an accountant. And it didn't seem very likely that you were going to end up as a Trailblazer Prize winner when you were a little kid. So what happened? How did you end up in science?
Yeah, I had a very unusual path to becoming a physician scientist, and in some ways an unexpected path. When I was an undergraduate, I got hooked into science somewhat circuitously. I decided I was interested in physics and math and really wanted to understand this, but physics seemed a little bit unrelated and hard to really do the kind of experiments you'd want to do. And so I ended up exploring a lab in biophysics, and then worked my way into thinking about lab research and molecular biology research. But I just happened to apply to MD PhD programs. And it was a little bit of a mistake, because I was probably the wrong sort of person to go to medical school. The medical school shouldn't have accepted me. But that really, I think, changed my whole career. And a couple of things happened very early on. The first was, I went to medical school, and I had no idea if medicine was the right thing for me, and I realized that I needed to get more exposure to patients. And that, as I'll maybe come back to, really had a huge impact on what I ended up working on subsequently. The second thing that happened was I met a lot of mentors who made me realize that there's just tremendous joy in this career of being a physician scientist, and how much you can do, and how they themselves have and continue to benefit from living this dual life and really learning from our patients. So that's sort of in a nutshell, what really drove me.
So tell me about the 24-year-old patient you met while you were shadowing the hematologist.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I was a little bit of an unusual first-year medical student, because, like I said, I had very little clinical exposure. And at the time, I wanted to see what clinical medicine was like. And I had the fortune to actually go into a pediatric hematology clinic, a clinic I now practice in. And I was seeing all these patients, and I met a patient at that time whose name is Robert. He was 24 years old, a little older than I was at the time. And he had sickle cell disease. And for the first 17 years of his life, he had almost weekly pain episodes, required frequent hospitalizations. And then 7 years before we met, things had changed dramatically. He had started a drug, hydroxyurea, which had actually been developed by some of the people who ended up becoming my mentors. And that had totally transformed his life. And it turned out that the drug hydroxyurea does, through somewhat unclear reasons, turns on a switch that normally happens during development, but reverses that switch. So typically, when we're in the womb, we express a fetal form of hemoglobin. That gets turned off shortly after birth, and then the adult form of hemoglobin gets turned on. And it's that which is mutated in sickle cell disease. So that adult hemoglobin is what causes the manifestations of sickle cell disease. So if you could reactivate the fetal hemoglobin, patients could do much better, just as Robert did. But what I realized was that the work in the 1980s that had led to hydroxyurea was certainly beneficial, but our understanding of that process really hadn't advanced much since that time. And so I spent a lot of time trying to study this problem, but failing. And fortunately, and really thanks to a lot of advances that happened in the field of human genetics, we were able to employ insights from human genetics to make advances and to understand a key regulator of this process.
Thank you. Serendipity, right?
Yeah.
So, Dr. Chang, you had a very different beginning to your life, growing up in Taiwan and really not even speaking English when you first came to the United States and started school in Irvine. So tell us a little bit about how you ended up as a scientist from those beginnings.
Sure. So I was born in Taiwan, and I moved to the U.S. when I was 12. And so that was a daunting transition, right? Because basically I didn't speak any English, so like every class was English class. Science class was English class, math class was English class. I was just trying to like catch up. And I think that was actually, in retrospect, a kind of really good preparation for being a scientist, because it's okay to like, you know, feel like you're failing all the time, because you just chip away at it and then you make some small progress. But my first sort of science sort of experience was that I was in high school and there was like a science fair coming up. So I came up with this idea, I was gonna do this experiment. And my high school biology teacher very kindly said, okay, you can use the lab in the school. So I would cycle in every morning, 6 in the morning, so I can use the lab before all the classes started. And he saw me kind of doing things, but that high school lab had very few pieces of equipment. So he said, you know what, I have a friend from church who is a professor at a local university, University of California, Irvine. Let me talk to him, maybe you can do something in his lab. And that was sort of my introduction to lab-based research.
And look at you today. Yeah. So you also had a serendipitous experience that you told me about when you were studying for your derm boards. You suddenly had an aha moment where you realized that some of the autoantigens you were trying to memorize reminded you of something else. Tell us about that, because it's really related to the important work on the X chromosome that you discovered.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I was really excited by what I was talking about, this finding that this really increased risk for autoimmune disease in women, which is obviously well known in the field, but there was not a molecular explanation. The way that the insight came was actually through the process called, it's not through a test. So in the US, doctors have to take a test every 10 years to renew their board certification. And so it happened that my lab was studying this particular long non-coding RNA. We found all the proteins associated with it, so that was biochemistry. So during the day, I was studying these proteins, but at night, I was studying for this test. And so I was memorizing what are called autoantigens. These are proteins that patients with autoimmune diseases would make antibodies against. And different patterns of autoantigens mean different diseases. So I was memorizing this list, and all of a sudden I realized, hey, this protein I saw this morning on my list of proteins associated with this, and then there's another one, and then another one. Then I realized, oh, maybe I should make like a systematic graph, and then that really kind of like hit me over the head, like, wow, there's some sort of really substantial enrichment here. We should have a look at this question.
And that was the beginning.
Yes, I'm one of the very few people who appreciated taking this exam among all the doctors.
That's great. So, I know a little bit about your backgrounds and the write-ups of your labs in the internet world are really fabulous. You have amazing people working in your organizations, and you're doing really broad work. We're just barely touching the surface of the science that you're pursuing. But we're here kind of celebrating team science. I'd like to know how you go about, for both of you, how you go about building a science team. Who do you look for to bring into your lab? How do you manage the process of a diverse group? So I'll start with you, because I probably have the most familiarity with the depth of your work, but how did you assemble this amazing WISE crowd?
Right. Well, first of all, I think that I'm somewhat choosy because we're looking for both excellent scientists, but also great team players, right? Because there are people who are very good, but they do that by stepping on their colleagues, and that's not going to work in the long run. And so we really carefully pick people who want to work together. And this is also a kind of training, because I think the incentives in science sometimes are favoring people who try to grab all the attention. And that's something actually we really want to teach our trainees that actually we're in it for the long run, right? These are going to be your colleagues for a long time. And so it's important to build relationships and to work together.
Create an environment where there's so many people who are working together. And I've had the benefit of seeing my own mentors who've, mentored generations of people who've gone on to do great things, and trying to then be that mentor to the people in my laboratory has been critical. And I think it's really important as well, as you said, to bring together these different serendipitous areas of expertise people have. People come at it with a diversity of experiences and perspectives, and I think one of the great things is bringing together people who might not know about blood cells and who might be interested in applying their expertise to blood cells, or who might be experts in blood cells and yet who might not realize that there are genomic technologies like what Howard has developed that could be applied to understand a critical problem there. And so I think it's really just trying to hopefully try to match make as well.
So when we're thinking about your work, you're making these scientific discoveries, but you're also both very focused on translating those discoveries into things that really matter to patients. In a sense, you're both trailblazers in that sense. Both of these people have MD, PhDs, and both of them would be qualified for the Trailblazer Award. But I want to ask you about your experience in going beyond sort of the traditional translation, because you're an inventor. You have many patents, you have created some businesses. Tell us about that entrepreneurial outcome of your lab work.
Right, so it turned out that the entrepreneurial experience was very rewarding. I learned a lot from the process, and also it helped actually get the science out to many, many more people who could actually benefit from the technology. So one of the technology we invented is called ATAC-seq. It's a very sensitive way to find DNA switches. And so when this paper was published, we started getting people calling the lab, a lot of calls, okay, about asking questions. How do you do this? How do you do that? Can you help us? And then I think the students are, they're very patient. They want to help, but they're to do their own research. They're not there to do customer support. Right, so, but once we actually sort of started the commercialization process, it actually, these professionals took over, and they actually just made things work even better. Many more people who are not even molecular biologists could access the technology. So sometimes I meet people and they say, oh, we use your method, and they're in completely different fields from what I work in, right? That's so satisfying.
Thank you for that. You have taken translation in another direction. For people who aren't familiar with sickle cell disease, it is an important disease in the U.S., but it's relatively rare here. And most of the people who have hemoglobinopathies, either sickle cell or beta thalassemia, live somewhere else. So you went somewhere else, to Sri Lanka, so that you would have a better clinical appreciation of the problem. So describe that experience.
When I was finishing my medical training, I really wanted to get more exposure to what the challenges were in not only seeing the patients that we saw in our
funded and really kind of nicely organized clinical setting, but really to see what was happening more broadly. And so I did spend time in Sri Lanka working in a thalassemia clinic there that the late David Weatherall had actually helped to establish. And that really taught me a lot. And I think it still continues to fuel what we do, because I think one of the really incredible things to see in my own career was the discoveries we made now being translated to therapies for patients. And yet at the same time, you see the challenges even as we apply these to patients. How can we get enough blood stem cells to be able to deliver these therapies? Patients typically need to have stem cells collected over months to years. Can we improve upon this and deliver these kind of therapies to patients directly rather than needing to collect their stem cells and then give those stem cells back? Can we develop small molecule approaches? And so I think there's just so many questions that build upon the kind of problems that we see as clinicians.
You know, we at FNIH are beginning a project looking at sickle cell disease in Africa and thinking about how could we create relevant solutions that would be practical and feasible in that environment. And right now, it's almost impossible even to get hydroxyurea into those communities, and trust is a big factor in that. So how do you think about trust and building trust in molecular science when you're offering people these new kinds of therapies?
Yeah, well, I think that that's such an important aspect, and I'm so delighted to know, that of the Kovler Award that really celebrates and recognizes the importance of scientific journalism. And I think that even as scientists, we need to strive to really be the best communicators, to not only think about the science that we're doing, how we advance the approaches, but how we ensure that the broader community is able to understand what these advances are, what we're seeking to do, and ultimately also the limitations of our knowledge and how our knowledge is always evolving. But as we make advances, hopefully we can start to benefit many patients and continue to advance upon the approaches. So I think it's critical to be able to communicate, just as I try to communicate as best as possible to my patients. But I think it's also important that we create a community of people who can communicate. I think journalists have such a critical role in communicating what we do to a broader audience and ensuring that they understand it. So it's just fantastic to be in celebrating not only scientific work, but really our ensuring that we can improve trust in this process.
Our 15 minutes has flown by here. I feel like I could talk with you all night, but I will not abuse the audience since we've had a wonderful evening. But when I was talking with you, Vijay, you said science driven by patients is so gratifying. And I think the two of you are exemplars of that philosophy. We're really proud to be able to honor you in this way, and we look forward to hearing from you and watching your science progress. Congratulations, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So they're fantastic, and I think would even be candidates for the Kovler Award. They're incredible communicators. So before we close tonight, I really do want to take a minute to thank the FNIH staff. There are many members of our team who are here in the room, but there are many others who contributed to the preparation behind the scenes. They really put a lot of work into this. It is the kind of work we love, and we are grateful to have an opportunity to serve in this way. But I really would just like to have a little applause for the team. But again, I thank all of you for making time to be here. Your support for FNIH in this evening really is a major source of funds for our Building Bridges to Breakthroughs Accelerator Fund. And as I said earlier, you're not just investing in our science programs, you're investing in creating hope for patients everywhere. You let us amplify and accelerate the important work of the NIH, work that is not always appreciated, and these days work that needs to be amplified as much as possible because it's so critical, not just to people's health, but to the overall health security of our nation and our neighbors around the world. But you and your contribution to us and your support are what allows us to ensure that the promise of science really becomes a reality for the patients who are waiting. So thank you for joining us. Have a safe trip home, and we hope to see you next year. Thank you.